I'm Terry Thornton. I'm Curator of Education here at the Modern, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Tuesday Evenings at the Modern. Tuesday Evenings is a weekly lecture series that happens each fall and each spring, and tonight is the finale for what has been a challenging and I think immensely satisfying season. A lot of you have shared it with me, and I think I would get some agreement on that. So, aptly, we are going out with some of art's or philosophy's most important questions, such as what defines art, what is the purpose of writing about it, and facing our current tumultuous reality, why bother with art at all? So, that's what you're in for. As the artist and art writer Jarrett Earnest frames it, these are fundamental questions that, with the history of art having collapsed under the weight of the contemporary world, we must ask anew. Jarrett Earnest is, of course, the guest speaker for tonight's final Tuesday evening, and I love that this is our farewell lecture until we begin again in February. It leaves us with so much to think about, to discuss, and to filter other related information through. I suspect I'll be hearing from some of you after tonight's lecture, which is always my favorite kind of lecture. Jarrett Earnest is the author of What It Means to Write About Art, Interviews with Art Critics, published in 2018, which I am currently making my way through and loving absolutely every minute of. He was the editor of Hot, Cold, Heavy, Light, 100 Art Writings, 1988 to 2018 by Peter Schjeldahl, published in 2019. And Peter Schjeldahl, who lauds Jarrett for his thoughtfulness and interview skills in a very engaging and informative conversation the two had for the David Zwirner podcast Dialogues. I highly recommend it. Of course, you can Google that. Jarrett's criticism and long-form interviews have appeared in many books and exhibition catalogues, most recently Pelle, Luc Tuymans at the Palazzo Grassi in Venice this year, and Willi Smith, Street Couture at the Cooper Hewitt, New York, 2020, so upcoming, as well as critical publications such as The Brooklyn Rail and Art in America. In addition to writing and interviewing artists, Jarrett is a curator, having curated The Young and Evil at David Zwirner Gallery in New York this year, 2019. And last for tonight's intro, not the last, I have to keep this brief so we can get started, but the last for tonight's intro, but certainly not the least, I was thrilled to learn that Jarrett has a Bruce High Quality connection. Bruce High Quality, some of you will remember, sent representatives for one of these very Tuesday evenings a few years back. Jarrett was faculty liaison at the Free Experimental Art School, BHQFU, 2014 to 17. So tonight, Jarrett Earnest is here to present Uninhabitable Art World, The Futures, Art, and Criticism. Please join me in giving him a warm Tuesday evening's welcome.
Hi. Thank you, Terry, very much for having me and also for that introduction. It truly is my pleasure to be here with you in Fort Worth. I've never had the occasion to come, and I spent the day just in awe of the work, not only in this museum, but across the way at the Kimball, things that I've always wanted to see. So thank you for having me. The way that I wanted to approach the talk tonight was basically just a couple prefatory statements about things that I've worked on to give you a sense of how I'm coming at some problems that I see in contemporary art. And then I want to read as a case study an essay I've been working on for the past few months that I think in a way addresses some of the questions that I have, and then open it up to questions at the end. Uninhabitable Art World. The reason why, in an abstract way, when you're invited to give a talk months in advance, I kind of never know like where I'm going to be at emotionally or intellectually, and so by the time I show up, it always seems like I'm like slightly not quite where I said I was going to be. But I'll explain how I even got to that place. So I did this book that came out last year called What It Means to Write About Art, which is a very non-glamorous title. But I was hoping that the lack of glamour could be like a Trojan horse for a book that is really fun and weird and personal and can go all over the place. So the reason why I did this is because I started writing about art. I went to art school as an artist, and when I would read things written about art, I really thought that they were stupid and didn't relate to anything that I cared about. And I thought, well, I could do better than that, because there's nothing like being an arrogant 18-year-old or whatever. And then once I actually started writing about art, I found like I had all these questions about it. And because I had an education that was as a conceptual artist, I feel like I approach everything in that way. That's like, okay, here's a problem, I'm creating a project to address it, and then like it unfolds. So I started by just wanting to interview everyone that I thought wrote about art in a consequential way for like the past half century, and talk to them about why they did it and how they did it, and how they had the values that they did. And that was something that I felt like I never saw anyone talk about before. Like you would say, you know, according to Michael Fried's essay, Art and Objecthood, Donald Judd X. But then it's like, that essay, first of all, is amazing and crazy, but no one's like, okay, in a metacritical way, like, who is Michael Fried? And like, why does it matter what he has to say about minimalism? You know, like, and why does he like hate it so much? And I wanted to know the answers to those questions because, you know, we look at art as whole human beings. You know, we have histories, we're situated within time and place, and we have personal experiences, we're invested in a social reality. All of that stuff, even the petty stuff, like this person fucked that person and then they didn't invite that person to a party, that all gets baked into an intellectual history that otherwise just disappears as the texts go into the world and they enter into history and people study them in Austin or Pacoima or wherever. So I wanted to try and create a record of that, or a kind of emotional intellectual map of like how we got into this situation from what often gets talked about as the golden age of criticism after the Second World War in New York to today, which people often talk about as the dumpster of criticism. So I interviewed all these people like Hilton, and I also wanted to interview people who were very different. So like old, like very, very serious academic art historians like Rosalind Krauss and Hal Foster, putting them in relationship to critics for newspapers like Roberta Smith and Peter Schjeldahl, and then people who write about art from really different perspectives. Siri Hustved is a novelist, Eileen Miles is a poet, and once you do that, I thought the most interesting intellectual gesture was letting them all kind of sit side by side and say, like, you know, all these people exist and they all have reasons, different reasons for doing what they do, and to let them be non-hierarchical in relationship to each other and say, like, you could do it this way or that. And the biggest thing that I learned from doing that was basically a sense of freedom that was like, before, I think there was some oppression about like, okay, I'm an art critic or like an art historian or whatever. What does that mean? Well, it turns out it means whatever you want it to mean, and it's really your responsibility to take the reins and figure that out. And that became really, and then I was like, ooh, cool. Like, so what is my thing? Like, what do I want to write about art? So Hilton, Lucy, and then the other project that I would say that relates to this is the show that I curated that opened earlier this year at David Zwirner. This is the it's called the F&G, the folded galley, folded something galleys. It's all the parts of the book before it gets turned into the book. And the book doesn't come out until the beginning of next year. But I'm really proud of it. And this show was really fun to do because I could basically do my weird thing like this, but through objects. So I was interested in a group of artists and writers and photographers and sculptors and painters who were all friends with each other. They were all gay. They made art that looked like weird, reactionary, figurative painting, often of each other. And they were at the very, very center of advanced culture in America. And then they subsequently, historically, get shunted out of the storyline, out of the dominant history of American art. And I was interested in okay, obviously there's a lot of homophobia involved in that, but what else? So I started doing research that took me into finding archives in garages in Newburgh and in the Kinsey Institute in Bloomington, Indiana, and all over the place, really. A lot of art that was in private collections because it was too freaky and weird for other places to want to show. A lot of dicks, just putting that out there. Didn't put them in this exhibition, but a lot of dicks. From the 30s, you know what I mean? So it's having a photograph of your boyfriend's hard dick in your mouth from 1930 is kind of incredible compared to doing it now, because it's why would you do that now? Who cares? But at the time when it was literally illegal and pathologized, that's interesting, and you could never show it to anyone. So you obviously made it from some very deep place. Those were questions that were interesting to me. This is the head of an article that Jerry Saltz wrote about the show, A Radical New History of Queer Modernism, but The Young and Evil is reactionary too. I actually thought it was an interesting article. This is a thing of the painting. This is a tempera painting that is probably the first portrait of a gay throuple, maybe, from 1939 to 40. So photographer George Platt Lyons is sitting there on the blanket on the far right. The novelist Glenway Westcott, who was actually a quite well-known novelist in the early part of the 20th century. He wrote this book, The Pilgrim Hawk, which is just excellent, is there in the weird leather kimono thing. And then on the far left is Monroe Wheeler, who was the director of exhibitions and publications at the Museum of Modern Art for most of its existence. They all lived together in a relationship for a long time. That's the house in New Jersey that they lived in with some guy mowing the lawn. And so to me, this show was about art that was a problem and that people really didn't want to talk about, because they think it looks stupid and they don't like the way it fits in history and it's conservative and maybe fascist and who would make paintings at this time of this subject matter. And so I think everything I do is almost like a proposition or a test, and then I want to see okay, what happens if I do this. And it was a show that was more about posing problems than solutions. However, I feel that we're living in a moment where everything is interpreted as 100% affirmative or transparent. So it's if you do a show, that means that you love the work and you're saying it's really good and important work. And it's actually, that's not what I'm saying. How can that be the stakes? Everything has to be exactly what you mean. Can't you say I think this is interesting and we look at it without saying actually, this is what art should be. And, I got hundreds of people who make terrible figurative paintings of naked men, emailing me after this, and I had to be look, I actually don't care about this. I don't care about paintings of naked men. They're naked men are fine. But you're misunderstanding the kind of questions that I'm interested in. And that was interesting to me, and that's something I'm still thinking about. But what undergirds both these projects and why I think they're interesting to put together is that I think they're asking deeper questions about not only about history itself, how history gets written, told, what enters into history, and how it's told. Those then started to appear to me literary questions, formal questions about narrative, exactly how the story is told. I think the fact that I love Gombrich's book, the Story of Art, which is like he wrote for like high school students, which is amazing because it has this literary storytelling thing that's very easy to follow. It's engaging, but like the operative word to me is like it's the story of art. It's a story, and the ways that we tell a story on basically a technical level are all larded with conceptual and philosophical import in ways that almost never get acknowledged, that I experience. And so the deeper question that I've been asking myself, I don't know if you read much art criticism. I doubt you do, because I don't think many people do. And like, this is what I do, and like, I don't really read art criticism. I mean, I read it, but every time I read it, I usually get frustrated and mad, where I think like, first of all, this is like, to say even something is a stupid idea is giving it a lot of credit, because you're acknowledging that it's an idea. And I often am like, this is not an idea. Like, this is not a thing. And the other part is like, it's not only not a thing, but like the way which you're expressing that non-idea is so painful as a subterfuge to deny the absence of an actual thought. So I think everyone is feeling very unmoored around like what matters. Like, it's like if everything's okay, then like what even matters? And it's reflective on every level. It's like you see the way that museums are approaching shows or hanging collections, or people talking about criticism, is that, or talking about artworks. A lot of the times I'm just like, who cares? Like, why does this matter? Why should you do this rather than go to the beach with some like babe and like have a blast? You know what I mean? Like, what's the point? And that's the space that I really feel like we have the opportunity to intervene right now at art, is like return to like a most essential question about why this thing should exist, why you want to spend your time making it, why I want to spend my time looking at it. And that is a relationship. Like, you are in a relationship. I think the writer on art embodies the position of a kind of ideal spectator of the thing. They like model one way in which like a work of art could matter to anyone, because it's like, why am I taking the time to write about it? So with all of that as kind of a backdrop, I want to read this text that I've been working on, that I think will give you a sense of where I'm coming from. This is for a book that I'm working on about contemporary art. The only people that have heard it before are about 10 people in a castle in Umbria last month. And it'll be published in a catalog in the University of Colorado late next year, for a retrospective of an artist that I'm going to talk about in the book, or in the essay. And then it's also fits into this bigger project of mine. So I want to just kind of dive into this, and then afterwards like take it from there and talk about it. So this is called Of Mere Being. And there's something called like an epigraph, and this essay has one. A gold-feathered bird sings in the palm, without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. Also, just so you know, it's in 7 parts, and so I'll read the numbers as we go. 1. In the spring of 2018, I got off a bus at the edge of Saint-Maximin in Aix-en-Provence and trusted that the medieval streets would flow towards the basilica at the center of town. As I entered, the church organist started playing Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah. Hearing a beloved pop song by recently deceased Canadian Jewish cum Buddhist singer-songwriter, I chose to take it as a good sign, as if God were saying to me, "It's cool that you flew from Brooklyn on a pilgrimage. I get your sense of humor about it, but also that you're sincere." By the third chorus of Hallelujahs, I found the stairs to the crypt beneath the nave, a small room with Maltese crosses carved on the marble floor, worn smooth as satin. A decorative grate covers a niche at the back of the crypt, which houses a gilded reliquary. 2 angels holding a life-sized bust with sinuously carved hair that frames a human skull. The bone isn't white but dark, almost black. A waist-high barricade a few feet in front makes the thing hard to see. I could discern the sockets of eyes and nose within the shadows of the niche. According to the medieval golden legend, after Christ's resurrection, Mary Magdalene boarded a boat without rudder or sail and arrived in southern France, where she lived the rest of her days praying in a cave. The inscription on an early Christian sarcophagus, found on the site of the basilica in 1279, indicated that it preserved the saint's mortal remains. The skull has been displayed and revered ever since. This is what I'd come to see, and I stared a long time. Even so, I couldn't explain why I was there, just that I wanted to be, and trusted that a purpose would reveal itself in the process. Leaving the church, I hired a car for the 45-minute uphill drive to the hostelry of St. Baume. Maintained by Dominican friars to house pilgrims, the building features a chapel decorated with pre-Raphaelite-style paintings of a strawberry blonde preaching to the fishermen of Marseille. From there, it's a walk, taking another 45 minutes up the mountain, a 12-kilometer ridge of rock jutting from the land called a massif, to the church that was built where Mary Magdalene reputedly passed her last 30 years in contemplation. Popularly termed the Grotto, it has been a monastery since the 5th century. The forest below it looks art-directed for a Jean Cocteau fairy tale, dense with gnarled oak trees which thin into beeches and then disappear as you ascend. I picked up a couple of stones as talismans on the walk, each far older than the Magdalene by millennia. Eventually, a staircase with 150 steps led me to the base of a sheer cliff face, where a simple facade spans the entrance to the cave. Double doors are inset, with 1970s-style, vaguely New Agey, semi-abstract stained glass windows, which illustrate the Magdalene's life. The cave's craggy sides contain niches for statues and candles. At the center is an elevated neoclassical altar, facing rows of freestanding wooden pews. Everything is wet, with water that drips ceaselessly from the rock ceilings and walls, and resound throughout the space. I spent several days reading, praying, and thinking, shuttling between my small room in the hostel, the grotto, and the tiny chapel of St. Pylon at the peak of the massif. On my last day, I loaded up on religious merch at the gift shop across from the hostel, postcards for friends, and, for myself, a 6-inch plaster figurine of Magdalene completely covered in her long hair. Then I went to the brasserie next door and checked my email via Wi-Fi for the first time. There was a message from Tony Williams, writing from the palliative care unit of St. Thomas Elgin General Hospital in southern Ontario. His wife, Anne Trueblood Brodsky, was an early mentor of mine. I have immensely sad news. Anne has suffered a massive stroke, which led to bleeding in her brainstem, which will lead to her death. By now, it was late afternoon. I walked back up the winding path among the trees, remembering lines of Wallace Stevens that I'd always associated with Anne. After the final no, there comes a yes, and on that yes, the future world depends. No was the night. Yes is the present sun. I had just enough time to light candles before Vespers began. Sitting on a wet wooden pew, I felt the cold creep in from the depths of the cave and tried to follow the prayers without understanding the words. Number 2. As an undergraduate of Central Michigan University in the early 1960s, Tim Whiten rebelled against a sculpture teacher who insisted he focus on academic figure modeling. Whiten had already come across the first issues of Art Forum, as well as contemporary magazines like Art in America and Art International. He was interested in lineages of abstraction that stemmed from Konstantin Brancusi, which made Beaux-Arts technique seem beside the point. Through books, he'd also discovered African sculpture, which excited him. He tried to learn everything he could about it, dissecting their sophisticated formal languages in which figures swell out of matter while leaving traces of their material's original form. They seemed to be alive. Those objects' materiality perfectly complemented the phenomenology he had been studying with psychologist and philosopher Dr. Oscar Oppenheimer, whom he considered his academic father. Whiten deduced that some of the African works had used fire, employing hot coals to bore a hole, for instance, and decided to explore it as a carving tool. When the instructor saw him take a blowtorch to a hunk of black walnut, he yelled, "What do you think you're doing?" Whiten replied, "This is ancestral. It's part of my blood." The resulting abstract bust resembled the undulant shapes of a living flame. Its surface was scalloped with chisel marks that darken into smooth, burnt cavities. One photograph from the time shows young Whiten looking at this object as though lost in meditation. After graduation in 1964, he entered the University of Oregon to pursue an MFA in sculpture, working with constructivist Jan Zach and continuing his investigation of phenomenology with Dr. Bertram Jessup. At a party, he met fellow graduate student Anne Trueblood Brodsky, who was finishing a thesis on Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. When Brodsky discovered his interest in nonverbal communication, she asked him to guest lecture in the literature class she was teaching. Brodsky was slightly older, returning to school as a single mother after divorcing her first husband and leaving life as a modern dancer in San Francisco. A birthright Quaker, she had a profound connection to Quakerism's history of social activism and quiet contemplation. Whiten felt that she understood what he was doing better than anyone he had ever met. Much of his work from that time was direct carving into wood and stone, recalling the biomorphic forms of Jean Arp and Henry Moore, along with an investigation of oceanic, African, and Native American processes. One cement piece was a spiral of bone shapes arranged into a flower with a mound at its center. The material was darkened by pigment, then painted black. Describing his intentions in an accompanying master's thesis, he quoted the Bible. "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now in part, but then shall I know even as I am known." After returning from Vietnam in 1967 and completing his active military service in 1968, Whiten was ready to get back to making work as a way of processing experience. By then, Brodsky had immigrated to Canada and was now editor of the country's preeminent art magazine, Arts Canada. Tragedy avoided, but I still want to just wipe the keys off. Thank you so much. I thought it was so ambitious putting a thing of water up near me. All right, I think that's going to be fine. All right, let's see where we left it. Oh, there. Under her direction, the publication was both interdisciplinary and thematic. Starting with the landmark Black issue of 1967, Brodsky brought together painter Ad Reinhardt, musician Cecil Taylor, filmmakers Michael Snow and Aldo Tambellini, among others, in an issue-long conversation punctuated with images that ranged from alchemical diagrams to Black Panther posters. During a phone conversation, she encouraged Whiten to apply for a teaching position in the Faculty of the Arts Division of Humanities at Toronto's York University. Arts Canada brought contemporary Indigenous art and Canadian regional painting into dialogue with the newest arguments from New York and abroad on burgeoning conceptual, video, and performance art. It was through this matrix that Whiten entered the Canadian art world of the 1970s. Whiten's work intentionally bridged European modernist abstraction with the sacred arts of the African diaspora, as seen in his series of river rocks, tree limbs, and ropes, all covered in leather. One issue of Arts Canada, Stones, Bones, and Skin, from 1973-74, situated Whiten's new three-dimensional objects within a survey of ritual and shamanic art, which Brodsky described as, quote, the significant cultural roots of art throughout the world. In the title essay, Mia Kirsty Stoggeberg described Whiten's studio: a table of rocks wrapped in leather to contain and bless them, sawdust, leather strips, rope hoops, animal hides, a chicken skeleton, and all the invisible collisions with other cultures vibrating in the air that help produce this isolated world of silence, sculpture, and growth. Number 3. Born in 1941 in Inkster, Michigan, a predominantly black suburb of Detroit, Whiten remembers an early fascination with bones. They were seemingly ever present. His mother, Mary, was at one time a butcher and kept cured meat hanging in the family's attic. It was commonplace to see them left on the kitchen counter, connected to the pleasures of family meals. This association strengthened when, as a kid, he happened upon a boneyard in the woods near their home. What hit him was the way they were stacked and arranged by someone or a group with intention. Without being able to articulate it at the time, he knew he'd found something set apart, a place where his community paid homage, remembered, and protected themselves and their histories. Scholars like Robert Ferris Thompson have shown how these boneyards, which proliferate across the U.S., are deeply rooted in African American spiritual practices transported from Africa. All Whiten knew in the moment was that it was important. Throughout school, his work gestured toward the body through abstract form. After his experiences in Vietnam and his deepening research into art from around the world, Whiten was ready to confront the body more directly, face to face. In the mid-70s, he asked a friend in medical supplies to help procure a human skull. He promised he wouldn't use it until he was sure of his actions, because the stakes and chances for misunderstandings were so high. For a month, it sat on a carpet in his home. He sat for long periods of time and looked at it every day. Finally, he placed it into a woven basket covered with white medical tape, lined with a fabric sleeve. Set on the floor, the viewer would have to bow to glimpse the contents, seeing only the top of the cranium. Whether this was a sculpture in the context of contemporary art seemed irrelevant. As a cultural object, it provided a link to an unbroken chain of human experience for thousands of years. In Christian art, saints are often shown meditating with human skulls, attending to undeniable proof of mortality as a way of envisioning the life beyond. Among the most sophisticated is a series depicting the Penitent Magdalene by French Baroque painter Georges de la Tour, the beautiful one right across the way. A large canvas in the Metropolitan Museum from circa 1640 shows the Magdalene sitting in contemplation, illuminated by a single flame reflected in a small mirror. The forms have been simplified to the point of geometry, emphasizing the picture's structure. Compositionally, the painting is built around strong diagonals running from the corners, following the chiaroscuro outlines of her illuminated body on one side and the implied upward movement of her hands, leading toward the reflected double flame on the other. They intersect at the very center where her interlaced fingers rest atop a skull. This underlying X is both dynamic and profoundly stable, intensifying the subject's interiority. She turns away from the viewer, aligning our look with hers toward the burning candle. The mirror's ornate frame parallels the picture plane itself, setting up a correspondence between the spectral world of the mirror and the representational space of the painting. It opens the stage for reflection upon the nature of things, light and dark, spirit and flesh, life and death. By the early 1980s, Whiten's engagement with skulls intensified. Increasingly, he sought compositional forms and structures which would heighten dynamics of confrontation and contemplation. He produced various reliquary forms, including adobe boxes, earthen architectural spaces, and glass enclosures, often amplified by performances which left traces and modifications on the objects. In Offering from 1981, a human skull covered with gold leaf was inset with circular yellow glass eyes, the kind that would be used for a taxidermied panther. It was placed atop a large wooden and glass table with a single chair, an invitation. In Penumbra, another from the same year, a skull was suspended in a net of human hair. Behind it were two mirrors, sandwiched face to face, the backing scraped from the closest one, leaving a central opaque silhouette of the skull, behind the skull. Light traveled through the glass and bounced between the reflective sides, producing a gentle glow around the skull, a soft halo, like the candlelight of the delator. The mirror's square frames were mounted at eye level, echoing the body, present and absent. In 1983, Whiten cast a human skull in glass, beginning a relationship with the material which has become central to his work. Glass undoes our usual experience of solid matter. With translucent or transparent glass, light and vision penetrate the interior volume in surprising ways, connecting it experientially to water or atmosphere. These effects have long infused glass with spiritual qualities. Translating bone into lead crystal moves the skull beyond mere signifier of death, promising the continuation of life in another form, an object that offers proof of transformation. Number 4. In another gallery in the Metropolitan Museum, there's a golden tabletop reliquary from the 14th or 15th century Tuscany. At the center is a piece of polished rock crystal, shaped like a large duck's egg. Down the middle of the clear stone runs a tapered vertical channel like a thin tornado, containing a beige tooth. My younger brother, who's a dentist, assures me that this is a maxillary first premolar from the top of the mouth beside the canine. This, too, is supposed to have belonged to Mary Magdalene. Teeth from the skull in St. Maximin, which has none, had to have ended up somewhere. But what matters to me isn't the provenance of the skull or the tooth, but just that each belonged to a human being who lived and died. I went to southern France to experience the gesture of the pilgrimage and to reflect on the apparatus of faith that had maintained it for centuries, making the relics meaningful as spiritual implements. The Magdalene, as we know her, is a mythological composite blending several minor characters and penitent saints from the Middle Ages. Biblical scholars unanimously agree that she was never the penitent prostitute of popular imagination. We know from the Gospels that she is the wealthy woman delivered from 7 demons by Christ, whom she then passionately follows and likely bankrolls. She is there at the crucifixion, watching, while the apostles, in fear for themselves, stay away. According to John, she goes with some disciples to the tomb. Upon finding an empty shroud, they leave, but she stays, weeping. A man asks why she is crying. She asks him if he took the body, and if so, would he please tell her where so she can retrieve it. Then he says her name, Mary, and she knows, against all reason and tangible evidence, that standing beside her is Christ resurrected. As she moves to embrace him, he pulls back, saying, "Touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father." He is no longer a person in the material world, but a manifestation earned by the depth of her belief. She is the first witness to Christ's triumph over death and its promise to the faithful of everlasting life. Magdalene is my favorite character in the Jesus story, due largely to the kinds of paintings and sculptures that she's inspired artists over the century to make, melding her persona with my own aesthetic and emotional uses for art. From the Middle Ages onward, she's the babe of the epic, so you get emphasis on her physical beauty, her lustrous long hair, luxurious possessions, qualities and things that oil paint glories in depicting. But the point of her tale is the irrelevance, if not the treachery, of all such pleasures. She transcends them. Almost every other female saint is defined by miraculous action and a bloody martyrdom. Magdalene's signature moment is the Easter morning scene, Noli me tangere, where her unfathomable sorrow tips into incandescent joy, and her impassioned reach is met with elegant retreat. In renderings of her apart from that episode, she's often shown as a penitent or contemplative, which tasks the artist with registering in external form the interior toils of thinking and feeling. This artistic challenge was perfect for a young Caravaggio, who made one of his earliest religious works a penitent Magdalene, this one. In a dark, seemingly empty room, a young woman sits slumped forward, a marionette without her strings. Glittering pearls and jewels are cast onto the floor beside her, and her eyes are closed. She's turned inward. Her life is changing radically. As in the later De la Torre, the stillness of the picture vibrates with an intensity of spirit. As we view the painting, our activity of looking generates thoughts and feelings of our own that are invisible to anyone around us. Our contemplation mirrors hers. It depicts the very beginning of her Christian life, but because we know the whole story, the entire narrative arc is compressed into our experience of it. We see her in the act of turning away from the world of things, but her sorrow is also that of the witness to the crucifixion and the empty tomb, and her inwardness is that of her future life as a hermit. The painting epitomizes art's specific power to enact what it represents. Number 5. Contingencies. Arts Canada's final issue was published in 1982. On the cover was a work by contemporary Haida artist Robert Davidson, showing a baby raven in the process of being born. Not long after, Anne and Tony moved to the Bay Area, intent on starting another magazine that would embrace the full sweep of the Americas, a mission that eventually morphed into a nonprofit gallery named Meridian. In the early 2000s, as a 20-year-old undergraduate at the San Francisco Art Institute, I was hired to help organize their archives during Meridian's move into a Victorian mansion off Union Square. Anne and I instantly bonded over modernist literature. Soon, I was her assistant, helping to curate exhibitions and organize events. Anne introduced me to her old friend Tim Whiten when we mounted an exhibition of his work in 2010, right before I moved to New York. As with everyone close to her, she was enthusiastic about whatever I wanted to do, and her belief made the doing seem inevitable. By 2018, Meridian had closed and Anne and Tony were living in a small town of Port Bruce on Lake Erie in rural southern Ontario, close to her friend Nick Johnson, who had also worked for Anne at Arts Canada. After receiving Tony's email that spring in St. Baume, I didn't hear anything more. It wasn't until I returned from Europe weeks later that I found Anne was still alive, recovering. Tim and I planned overlapping visits that August. I arrived early and waited on the porch for the medical transport van returning Anne and Tony from a doctor's appointment. The nurse unloaded Anne's wheelchair with a mechanical lift. Her face was half paralyzed, mouth contorted, with the flesh pulled away from her eye sockets, creating deep red rings. "Jarrett," she exclaimed when she saw me, and we went into the house. I'd brought a collection of Wallace Stevens, and she asked me to read some, starting with the one that I had recalled when walking to the grotto a few months before. Improbably, there was a 100-year-old palm tree tucked behind Meridian Gallery in downtown San Francisco. You could see its fronds from the gathering room on the 3rd floor. Anne always called it the palm at the end of the mind, after the opening line of Wallace Stevens' poem, Of Mere Being. She asked me to read that poem, and when I finished, to read it again. And here it goes. The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, rises in the bronze decor. A golden feathered bird sings in the palm, without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. You know then that it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. The bird sings, its feathers shine. The palm stands on the edge of space. The wind moves slowly in the branches. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. Those last lines hovered in the room for a long time. Tim had brought CDs of Reverend Dr. James Cleveland and the Southern California Community Choir, which played in the background all weekend. To help her swallow, we mixed a powder called Thicken Up, registered trademark, into her Quaker Calm tea, which she said was gathered once a year by Quakers in nearby Sparta, where she and Tony went to meetings. I watched Tim bring spoonfuls of the quivering amber to her mouth, making the whole thing look somehow elegant. A palm-sized glass rose he made for her absorbed the afternoon light. The next day, I walked over to the house to find them both gone without the slightest idea of where. Going back outside, I then saw Tim pushing Anne in her wheelchair along the road, returning from the shore of Lake Erie. They were both laughing. He had maneuvered her out onto the sand, and they sat for half an hour, looking out at the glittering horizon and talking. That night, Anne requested that we set up a projector in the living room to update her on our work. Nick gave a slideshow of his recent trip through the mountains of southern Mexico, attempting to create a map of old roads from oral history and an early pictographic map that he studies, which is in the AGO, the Art Gallery of Ontario. Tim showed process shots of new three-dimensional objects made with crushed cobalt blue glass. One small stepped pyramid was encrusted with it and had a frosted glass miniature staircase leading up to a red bloom at the top, a crystalline inversion of the cement bone flower from graduate school. In another, an anvil is covered with sparkling blue shards, sprouting a glass funnel and a wooden limb adorned with bottles, an elaboration of the bottle trees common across African American culture for channeling and protecting against spirits. I talked about visiting the skull and cave of Mary Magdalene in southern France a few months before, and then I showed paintings from the Etruscan tombs that I had visited afterwards in Tarquinia in Italy. The scenes showed celebrations and the joys of everyday life that the dead would carry with them into the next world. As we finished, I found it hard to leave because I knew it would be the last time I would see her. As I was turning to go, Anne stopped me to say, "Those images you showed, so beautiful," emphasizing every word. Number 6. The next morning, I woke up and drove 4 hours northeast to Woodview, Ontario, to visit one of the most significant groupings of Indigenous rock carvings in the world. I'd seen images of it in Stones, Bones, and Skin from the essay by anthropologist and art historian Joan Vastogas. What struck me was the sheer number of carvings, over 1,000, and the visual intensity of the forms, clustered and interconnected, stretching across the granite shield which plunges into dark folds. And archaeologists believe they were once 2 or 3 inches deep, but many are now mere impressions, gently eroded over time. One petroglyph is a figure with a long pole neck, topped by a large circle with a smaller ring inside. Lines radiate from the outer ring, suggesting a sun or giant eye. In reproductions, you can make out a wide array of creatures, a rabbit standing upright, a tall crane, zigzagging lines of serpents, lizards, and various animal tracks. One carving shows a turtle laying eggs, believed to represent the origins of creation, depicting Turtle Island in the stuff of the earth itself. These petroglyphs are believed to have been carved over centuries by early Algonquians between 900 and 1100 AD. though some scholars maintain they are much older. Today, the Anishinaabe call them teaching rocks, and it has been the site of sacred rituals and pilgrimages for at least 1,000 years. Whiten told me that when he visited in the 1970s, you could lie on the ground, place your ear near the holes to the crevices, regarded as openings to the spirit world, and hear the sounds of subterranean water. After arriving at what is now Petroglyph Provincial Park, I walked the short distance from a state-of-the-art visitors center to the large glass and steel building which encloses the site. A raised metal catwalk tracks the perimeter of the glass walls. I located the solar figure, the famous turtle, the large crane, though it is difficult to get close enough to really see them, much less hear the whisperings from underground. A bowl of burning sage filled the space with its beautiful smell. The place now is maintained by the Curve Lake First Nation, who continue to use it as a site for spiritual practice. In the early afternoon, I then doubled back, driving northwest about 2.5 hours into the wilderness of Gravenhurst, Ontario, to the Tree Museum. I followed a winding road into a dense forest where site-specific artworks are seamlessly integrated into the scenery. After a clearing, I reached an outcrop of Canadian shield, among the oldest igneous rock formations in the world that constitute the ancient core of the North American continent. It was the first area in this hemisphere to be elevated above the seabeds at the beginning of the world. Between 1998 and 2000, Tim Whiten created a series of sandblasted images into this rock called Dance. It was consisted of 12 roses arranged into 2 constellations and 4 skeletons drawn from Hans Holbein's engravings, The Dance of Death, from 1524 to 25. In Holbein's series, death takes the form of a skeleton, appearing to people of all ages and social station. Pope, emperor, knight, nun, duchess, plowman, and peddler. He drags them all away, sometimes violently, leading others with great tenderness. Approaching through the trees, you glimpse one of Whiten's skeletons beating a drum on an elevated swell of rock. Holbein's original are tiny, fitting in the palm of your hand. Whiten's are over life size. The afternoon sun casts shadows from the carved lip of stone, making a temporary drawing. Getting closer, I ran my fingers over the precise shapes cut evenly into the dramatically uneven stone. Whiten's other 3 skeleton carvings are less obvious. You find them by looking carefully beneath your feet at the site. They've become well integrated into the lichens and moss and vegetation of the place in the 20 years since they were made. Holbein's illustration, The Old Woman, in Holbein's illustration, The Old Woman, the figure walks in heavy robes, haunched over a walking stick. Jubilant death, adorned in a crown of leaves, holds her arm and walks beside her, following the skeleton playing a xylophone, hanging around his neck, which Whiten repurposed for his dance. All 4 of Whiten's skeletons play instruments: drum, trumpet, bagpipe, and xylophone. They're creating music, the recurring rhythmic structures of life: breathing, heart beating, cyclical celestial movement. A 16th century commentator observed that in Holbein's work, death had never seemed so alive. In an environment always changing, Whiten's dance is itself a living entity. Number 7. 4 days later, while driving through the Midwest in early September, I received 2 emails. The first Anne had dictated that morning and simply said, "What a wonderful time it was. Thank you. Love always." The second came from Tony with the sad news that Anne had suffered another stroke later that day. She is unable to speak. This is a quote. This was the email. She is unable to speak and is completely immobile. She can hear everything I say to her. We communicate through hand squeezes. Please, as the Quakers say, hold her in the light. End quote. I don't know what happened afterward, what it was like for Anne or Tony or the family and friends who were able to be there. I also don't know how Quakers hold people in the light, but I imagine it's just thinking about them with love. Anne was one of the most determined people I'd ever met and had a very strong will to live. I closed my eyes and tried to tell her that it was all right to let go. 2 weeks later, at the age of 86, she did. Tim Whiten doesn't believe in either art or death. Both, in his view, are constructions which subdivide an otherwise continuous sweep of human experience. For him, what is called art is an expression of the thoughts, feelings, and actions of everyday life, perhaps intensified into a form, but in no way distinct from them. What is called death is merely a marker from one form of existence to another. It is his belief that making objects and images allow for the engagement with those inseparable dynamics in what are then called life. The cultural object is a tool, aiming for a level of attention where every activity can become meaningful, almost a form of prayer. The following summer, I went back to Port Bruce to meet up with Nick, Tim, Tony, and their families. I brought my partner who had never met Anne. I wondered how to explain who she was, this person who connected all these random people. Nick's niece, Sarah, threw a party while everyone was eating pizza and laughing. Sarah threw a party, and while everyone was eating pizza and laughing, I realized that just being together was a way of remembering her. The next morning, Tony and I sat at the same wooden table where a year before I had read Wallace Stevens aloud, and Anne had been served spoonfuls of jellied tea by Tim. He showed me something he'd pulled from their papers, which were returning in boxes from San Francisco, a faded printout of their San Francisco Quaker meeting, recognizing the right to gay marriage in 1996. He read it out to me. It is fundamental to Quaker faith and practice that we honor the equality and integrity of all human beings. Therefore, it is our belief that it is consistent with Quaker historical faith and testimonies that we practice a single standard of treatment for all couples who wish to marry. Anne had saved it because she felt it was important, he told me. Then he showed me the polished wooden box which now contains her ashes, sitting on a table by the window. Embedded in the top is a glass rose that Tim had made, catching the light. Thank you. And now that we went on that journey, I don't know, I would love your thoughts, your questions, your comments. In a real way, this is a piece that is actively materializing. I'm editing it, changing it as we speak, so I would really love to know what you noticed or thought or what you didn't understand or, anyway. So anyone, if you just throw up your hand. Yeah.
I am glad I get to speak first because I just want to say, number one, that was beautiful, so incredibly generous, and I think probably a little exhausting for you and just a very kind thing for you to do for us. It was even better than fundamental questions. I'm glad you went that route. Maybe you can come back and do fundamental questions another time. But I don't want this to be insensitive, but I'm curious as to your feeling. This is one thing. Yeah. I don't want to be the people that thought because you did the show at Zwirner, you just love pictures of naked men. Yeah. I'm wondering if part of me wants to ask, but it feels completely insensitive. Do you love art more, or do you love writing more? But I think a more accurate question is, do you love art more, or do you love the stories more?
I think my answer to that question, I don't think it's insensitive in any way, is that the boundary between those things is really hard to find. looking at the Bellini painting of Christ's blessing, which is one of the great paintings of the world, where does the story stop in your ability to see it? Is it still and Michael Fried sort of says this in part of the interview I do with him, which I actually think was a great interview, but he says well, one, you have to recognize that it's a person. At what level is it that is a person, that person is Jesus, that represents the, it's all of that is a story. So our very ability to recognize anything as art at all is through a kind of discursive apparatus. So I think that what kind of separates me from a lot of people who write about art is that I really love art. And I think that art is a way of making your experience more meaningful than not art. And I think that only recently have I felt that writing could be a way of making that more meaningful than not writing. So I came later to writing. But I feel like a lot of people that I engage with in the art world don't care about art, actually. And I don't even know that it should be something we share. But I'm not interested in making a rule. But, I think everyone loves art differently is maybe a more generous way of putting it. I don't know, did that speak to anything you were asking? Mm-hmm. And I think, by the way, all of this is a way of me trying to breach all of those fundamental questions. And there are various ways in which I'm trying to do that. But anyone else? And also, there's no kind of I'm happy for any kind of question. It doesn't have to be, it can be critical, it can be, I'm pretty good. Yeah, in the very back.
You mentioned something about Tim Whiten and his opinion on art and death. I
Yeah.
wonder if you could expound on it just a bit more, what else has he said on the subject? In that conversation, you said you had a conversation with him about that.
Yeah. Well, it's a tricky, I don't know that it's successful. I think this is something that might need to be developed more. But Tim has his own religious experience. Is that? No, I thought I recognized someone in the back. Tim has his own spirituality, and that's his. And I don't know that is necessarily important for getting into the work. I think it's in the work, and what I'm doing is responding to it with the tools that I have or the experiences that I have. But Tim doesn't want his things to be called sculptures. He wants them to be called cultural objects. He's not interested in making art per se, because he feels that the idea of art as it functions now in contemporary life is an extremely diminished version of what art's job is. And one way that I tried to allow that to come into this without having to be so prescriptive was through these kind of concentric rings of what art could be. So on the one hand, you have a kind of lineage of a certain kind of religious Western art, Christian art. But on the other hand, I think that the move to the petroglyphs is really important. And then I think the petroglyphs' relationship to the Mary Magdalene cave is really important. That there is a kind of sacredness that exists in the material space of the world that is so old, that is before any art that we have. And that doesn't mean that there wasn't art. It just means that we don't have it. Humans existed for 100,000 years or more before there's a thing that we have showing that they existed besides bones. I'm really interested in that. You know, the earliest art that we have, and I think but Georges Bataille says this in his book on cave paintings, this is like, this isn't the beginning of art, this is the culmination of an extremely sophisticated society and visual tradition. I mean, it's already fully formed right there. I mean, across the way, there's a Sumerian ewes head, terracotta ewes head from like 3000 BC. You know, it's the most elegant, alive thing. So I think one of my responses to that is, you know, most people who write about contemporary art, they don't even have a real frame that goes back to the Renaissance. But that's not enough, you know? Like, for me, it's like, why don't we go back to like before we had language? That would be an interesting thing, when images dominated, when that's what we had, were images and stories, but not writing. Yeah.
I'm thinking about the landscape of writing in general today and how that relates to these bigger questions you're asking about art writing. You know, when I think about the kinds of writing we're engaging with every day, everything from, you know, 130 character tweets to, you know, blogs, to polemical journalism, to, you know, experimental writing. Like, do you think that there's something that writing about art can do uniquely today that can, I don't know if it's address or redress or engage with other kinds of questions or uphold certain values even? I mean, I'm just curious, like, for you and for, like, why do we write about art now?
Well, I think regardless of if I think it can, I don't think that one has a choice right now. Like, I think we have to go forward with the proposition that, like, it can do something, and otherwise you would not do it, right? And so I do feel very, very negatively about the field, the terrain of writing about art, about the mechanisms of distribution of, i.e. magazines and websites, and the way in which people engage with writing, the way that someone makes a living as a writer about art, which is called not making a living. So yeah, I actually am profoundly negative about all of those things. Like, I think everything's awful. But you can't live your life that way. You know what I mean? So I think that my solution is to try and do something about it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I guess that was my question. Like, it's not to ask an existential sort of question negatively about it, but, you know, hopefully, what can we do?
Well, my thing is, okay, so I think that there's like a foundational flaw in the way that contemporary art gets thought, which is that it's supposed to be uniformly meaningful or successful, like around the entire world all the time. And it's, you know, it's like from this biennial to that biennial, this is the same work, it's going around, the same artists, the same curators, and that's not possible. Like, culture, as far as I understand it and believe it to always have worked, exists in small groups of people who are having an in-depth dialogue with each other through making and talking over time. And I think that there will be, the only way forward is a return to a kind of entrenched, committed localization. And that isn't like, oh, now I'm going to art school in Portland, but I'm making art based on what it looks like through the internet of what people in Cologne are making. You know, it's like, that doesn't make any sense. So I think that I'm trying to do that as a writer. And so my two projects right now, one is I'm trying to write this book of essays, which is basically as though they were stories that people could read without any prior knowledge about art. That all of that, I have like all of these things that I'm interested in doing that I don't need to be obvious in the text. I just want people to be able to read them and think like, okay, like that makes me think about why I would want to look at a painting instead of not look at it. The other part is I'm starting a talk show that's going to be on the internet called Disagreeable Objects. that is going to be like, because like I've done interviews with artists and writers for years, and that's actually, I don't know that people read, but I think people watch things on the internet. So that's kind of my other plan. It's almost like, in a fundamental questions way, I think we're like at baby steps of like modeling what it's like when smart people who care about art talk to each other. And like if you are a young artist, like how are you going to learn that? You know what I mean? Like where are you going to see that happen? It's not in an art magazine. So yeah, those are my plans. And yeah, what else? Going for number 2?
Can I do 2?
Yeah.
So your feelings about art writing, art criticism, with the exception being the people you've interviewed,
Yeah.
that you are, I mean Lucy Lepard or Holland Cotter or whoever, those are people that you must find some value in what they're doing as writers.
Absolutely. No, I mean, there's a lot of people who write
whom I respect as a writer and I admire or whatever, but I guess I'm thinking more about like people who are my own age. Like everyone who occupies that position, they're writing. I mean, Peter Schjeldahl is a very dear friend of mine, and I love his writing, but Peter Schjeldahl is writing for a world that's a different world than the world that we live in. And that's just a sad fact.
What he said about, did he say everything that matters in our society is empty? Or do you remember that in your conversation? It blew me away.
I don't remember. I'm sorry.
It's like landscapes, the whiteness of the whale. Anyway.
Oh yeah, no,
He said that in the podcast. Yeah. Okay, I see people like shuttling out.
Yeah.
So, all right. All right. Thank you so much for having me.